Welcome to our LinkedIn Live. Stand by for the Bankers Book Club. Fred, Eric, Allison, Jack, to the studio.
We're the Bankers Book Club. Reading's what we do. From finance to leadership, we got a banker's view. Bankers Book Club. Where ledgers meet literature. Bankers Book Club. Making bankers better. Fred's all about tech. Eric loves digital trends. Jack trains to pros. Allison's expertise never ends. Bankers Book Club. Where ledgers meet literature. Bankers Book Club. Making bankers better. Bankers Book Club. Where ledgers meet literature.
Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of Bankers Book Club. I'm Fred Cavenna, joined again here by Eric Cook. Say hi, Eric.
Hi, Eric. Hello, everybody. How you doing?
Jack
Hey,
Hubbard.
everybody.
And of course, last but not least, Alison Netzer, who is also doing double duty as the author of this month's book.
That's
How's it
right.
going?
We're running this thing on a shoestring.
I love it. So we're really excited. Allison actually is the author of 2 books, and this month we are covering, I think, your first book, which is Think Like a Brand, Not a Bank. Really excited. Just, Allison, to give us a quick rundown of the 5 principles to kick us off.
Sure. So the 5 principles of this short book are: sometimes do the counterintuitive thing, which is one of my favorites. Embrace tension and create contradictions. Cue the remix. Product isn't what it used to be. Amen to that. And and coach and compose. So we'll jump into them and the group's insights on them here in a bit, because I get to kind of do the interviewing. But the big idea in the book is that harnessing brand power within financial services really demands a new way of thinking. Easier said than done, right? It's not quick, it's not easy, but Liz, my co-author, and I believe deeply, and I think all of you do as well, it's a shift that any FI can adopt. And it's worth the investment, because great brands really all speak the same language, no matter what industry they're in, and that language is returns. So cutting expenses and hoping for the best may feel safe when business is unstable, like a lot of what we're experiencing right now in the economy and the world. But to really be relevant today and tomorrow, my belief is that banks should take a cue from consumer brands, really move away from a purely transactional mindset and get into a more relational, purpose-driven approach. So that's the idea in a nutshell.
I absolutely love that.
Thanks. So the book, for folks who haven't read it, we'll put in the show notes a dramatic rendering of what has become known as the Starbucks story, which is right in the beginning of the book. So even if you don't read the whole thing, you can just read the 3 or 4 pages. So I'm curious, and Eric, maybe start with you. When you read the Starbucks story, what hit you about it first?
As a fan of Starbucks, somebody that probably has, 50 or 60 bucks sitting in the app, just in case I need to get me a mocha fix while I'm bouncing around sessions and presentations, it first hooked me that this is going to be an awesome book, because it had a humorous approach to the concept of, what if your banker jumped ship and went to go to work at Starbucks? And the whole segmentation of, you want a coffee? Is this for personal? Yeah, I want a coffee. And then a coworker calls and, you need to pick up a coffee for your coworker. And now you have to be transferred to a completely different department within Starbucks, because now it's a business coffee. And they seem to be agitated, almost somewhat pissed off that you didn't fully disclose that there was going to be a business transaction involved in this.
Right.
And it over exaggerates, but not to an extent that's unrealistic, how siloed and segmented we can be in the banking industry. I mean, I was a banker for 15 years, and it made me think back to the concept of, before everybody thought of a universal banker being someone that you can just come to, talk to me, whatever you want, and I'll take care of you. Everyone had their specific role that you had to fulfill. If you wanted an account, you talked to one person. If you wanted something about online banking, you talked to a different person. If you wanted a mortgage, you talked to a different person. And that was personified in this, because you wanted a coffee, you wanted a sandwich. What type of sandwich? That's not the sandwich that we're selling. So let me tell you about ciabatta bread instead of the sourdough.
Right.
It's like, I just want a freaking sourdough sandwich with a coffee and a coffee from my coworker. And it just was really hilarious. The thing that I would wonder is, if you were to rewrite this as a 2.0, what if the local barista became a banker, and you would walk into the bank, and now your favorite Starbucks person is sitting in the bank, and you ask a question, what that experience would be. So I'll just kind of throw that out there.
It's funny. It's funny you mentioned that, because reading the story, that's kind of what I was longing for. I was kind of longing for going back to the bank and hopefully finding the Starbucks barista over there running those operations.
Oh, that would have been good. That would have been good. The number of things you think about after
totally.
you've written a book that you want to throw in. And Jack, I know you're an author as well, and probably have the same feeling. But anything that stood out to you about the Starbucks story besides the 2.0?
I would be horribly nervous to hang out with Eric Mega Caffeine. It's bad enough when he drinks water. But what really
You're probably
struck
right.
me
I'll give you that.
about this is your quote in the book early on. Says great things can happen in silos. Great things happen when you break them down. And the first thing that jumped out at me was education. And I think we all have to understand that banking, and those of us that are bankers understand that it is a very different kind of industry. And when you sell Apple, you sell Apple. You go to an Apple store and everybody knows everything because they sell Apple. Banking is so different because, and you were talking before we started taping, about wealth management and treasury services. And then there's commercial and business banking. And it does get a little complex for a 19-year-old who would do really well at Starbucks, but is really challenged at banking. And I think one of the challenges that we have is, to your point about reducing costs, is we have done a very poor job of education in banking, teaching bankers how to observe, how to ask better questions, and cross-training them, which Starbucks does a really, really good job of. So it's just a great story, and it's something that bankers should be really looking hard at as they look at their branches for the future.
Got it. No, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things you mentioned with Starbucks is, the cross train, they can pivot, right? And I think that's in a nutshell what Liz and I were trying to get at there. There was a little poking of fun, but underneath it all is, how do we get to a point where we can pivot? And that's where brand mindset really comes in, right? Because you're able to pivot situationally, as opposed to just going from the training binder that you may have. So it's a good segue into the principles. The first one.
Before you transition, there's something I wanted to add, which was is the one thing I thought about as I was reading it was just the absurdity of it, and I tried to think of what other consumer business is built on the principle of that much friction. And this is going to be a very unflattering comparison, but what I got to was car dealerships. Car dealerships build their sales model on leveraging a lot of friction to kind of get somebody almost to the point where by the time they see the price, they are so frustrated and don't want to go through that anywhere else that they just capitulate and take the deal rather than having to go to another dealership and go through that whole thing again.
Sure.
I'm not suggesting banks add friction to the process for that reason, but what I got to was like how much of that friction that's in your story is there by design, and how much of that friction do we feel collaboratively really needs to still be there for risk management, for compliance, for other reasons, and how much of it is just legacy? Like how much of that friction is just because of somebody's mindset that started doing this 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and can really be eliminated from the process?
Right. No, I like where you're going with that. I think I'd like to hope that it's not necessarily by design. But one of the things, and this is, I mean, this is a sales tactic as old as time, is context, right? I'm not saying, or we're not saying in the book that, you've got to, throw everything out, screw the compliance, there are reasons for some of that friction to exist. But if it's there to benefit the customer, then you should be able to explain that benefit to them, therefore making that friction palatable or acceptable, right? If it's there to protect them, for example, let them know that. Don't assume that they know that, it's because of this regulation or that. So if it's there for a reason, that it's there for their benefit, then you should be able to clearly and concisely articulate what that benefit is as context before you take them through or during taking them through the process.
To your point, Fred, I could see, and I hadn't thought of it that way. You always do a really good job of finding like the angle that I wouldn't have considered. But if somebody were in a bank and they were interested in insurance or wealth management investments, then I could see that has a logical and a regulatory separation. You're not going to want to tell her giving investment advice. They're not qualified. They're not licensed. That legitimately needs to go to a different department. But the handoff needs to be probably more comfortable than maybe what some are. And it could very well, to Jack's point, result in education, because as a teller, I just know I'm not supposed to talk about that, versus what are the reasons for that? Why is that in the customer's best interest? Why is that a compliance and a regulatory requirement? Not that you want to burden the customer with all of the rigmarole as to why you need to talk to wealth management and I can't do that, but it helps the teller, the customer service representative, or the lender, whoever is making that transition, to understand. And while they may not verbalize it, the customer is going to tell that there's more comfort in that, as opposed to helplessness of, oh, I can't talk about this because they won't let me, so let me get you over to our wealth management person. They understand what's going on, and that subconsciously, I think, is going to come through and make the customer feel better. Whereas there's other things that with cross-training and education, you could very well have a conversation and answer some basic questions with that customer and not be running the line of compliance and regulatory, violations. So,
No, that's, you make a good point, because we don't want to use regulation, and compliance can sometimes be a crutch or an excuse to the friction. But you talked about handoff, and I want to bring it back to brand thinking, because one of, if you've ever been to a Banana Republic store or a J. Crew store, they actually have a protocol for handoffs when it's someone maybe who's the greeter at the front, who's handing off to someone in the middle, or a handoff to a manager. They have a 5-point system that they use to hand off to another employee when they have a customer. I'm not going to be able to remember all 5 of them, but the gist of it is eye contact, there's touch. So if Jack was a Banana Republic employee 1 and I'm 2, right, he would like touch my shoulder or whatever and just say, this is Fred and he's looking for a patterned shirt, right? There's kind of that repeat of information, so you don't have to repeat it again. So they actually have a protocol when it comes to a handoff that they're actually measured on from a performance standpoint. So that could also be something that we take inspiration from when it comes to moving someone, through the branch or even through your digital channels. Is what is that standard, that very high standard of handoff that lets folks know that they're going to be taken care of and they're not just getting pushed down the line.
I love that. And the one of the principles I didn't hear you say, because I'm sure it's not there, is frustration, right? And I remember at least a couple times in that Starbucks story where people were generally frustrated, like, oh, this is a business coffee now, or oh, baked goods. I don't handle baked goods. And I think that really speaks to, like, the institution also, as they're designing that handoff process, needs to make sure that incentives are aligned so that somebody who maybe is, would be compensated by putting somebody into a CD, and all of a sudden they kind of hear the clues like, well, maybe a CD is not the right product. I should get them in front of somebody from a wealth perspective. They're not penalized, right? They're not taking a hit, right? Those incentives need to be aligned so that that handoff is as smooth as possible and really in the customer's best interest.
Right. No, I completely agree. And, there's some inspirations, some kind of brand stories. There's actually a workbook that goes with Think Like a Brand, Not a Bank, that talk about that kind of customer experience when things get tense or when they get frustrated, how to really take more of a brand approach to that, which is ultimately more of a human approach. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. You can just sort of see what those examples are. There's some pretty good case studies of that. So cool. So on the 5 principles, so we've actually hit on most of them in the conversation, which is kind of cool. So we've got do the counterintuitive thing, which is, pretty self-explanatory. Embrace tension and create contradictions. Brands really thrive on contradictions. I think that there are some banks that have embraced this idea, which has made them become more memorable and distinctive. Cueing the remix, which is marketers' favorites, remixing old ideas for innovation. And then coach and compose, which is really, it's something actually I've benefited from even hanging out with you guys, right? Which is kind of guiding and supporting someone in a more personalized way, which I feel like I've gotten from this group. So the 5th one, Coach and Compose, was actually inspired by a colleague of mine. His name is Marcus Whitney. He's one of the founders of the Nashville Football Club, a soccer club, and he has an amazing story. He actually has a great book called Create and Orchestrate that we might want to cover one time. But I'm curious on the 5 principles. I kind of have your names by which ones I think you would choose. As I know, which is like which one speaks to you the most. So I am going to ask Jack which of the
Which
5
one do you think?
principles. Well, I wanted you to say it, then I would say wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I really wanted to do that.
You can do that.
I would say for you, Jack, Coach and Compose would be the one that I had sort of put your name by, but you can choose.
No, there is no question that coaching was the most important chapter to me. It's a huge challenge in our industry. And when you're trying to create a brand and messaging and how we look to so many different marketplaces, whether it be in the newspaper or on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever technology that you might use, without coaching, it absolutely doesn't work. So that was a really important thing to me. And I had, you talk about page 144. I'll read. A coaching culture could be nurtured within an institution because coaching tactics are learned behaviors. Spot on. Instead of sitting back and saying, we don't do anything with our great ideas, it's time to change your organization's mindset. So what jumped out at me when I thought about that is a word that you may not have heard of because you're so much younger than I am, but skunkworks. 3M used to allow, and maybe still does, their people to do skunk works projects, and they coach them on it and they reinforce this, and they want to say to them, look, you go be innovative. And I don't see that as much in banking. Quite honestly, if you look at this book, this is all 3M. 3M, a 3M skunk works project started the Post-it notes. Those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. But you teach people, whether it's you or Amber Farley or Eric or Lance Kessler, Tom Hurd, whoever it is, and you're going to go in and you're going to kind of do a rebrand without helping people understand how to do it, and without having the coaches understand how to coach it on an ongoing basis. This brand will fail. And I think if you talk about all the retail brands that you mentioned, Patagonia, Apple, all those stores and brands, they're coaching cultures, and we have yet to embrace that as an industry.
Why do you think that is?
I've heard a lot of crappy excuses. Time.
Sure.
I don't have time to coach. The worst one I heard was from a bank that I just walked away from it, not that day, but I called them and said we weren't a fit. They say, well, we hire adults, and so we don't need to coach anybody.
Oh my!
I think another part is they don't know how. They don't.
Michael Jordan had a coach.
Everybody
Michael
has
Jordan
a
did
coach.
have a
When
coach.
we went to
Tiger Woods has a coach.
well, to your point, my former business partner and I went to the Masters one year, and we spent a lot of time on the practice range because each golfer had a coach. And the golfer was far better than the coach, but the coach could see things that the golfer didn't. And that's the essence of coaching.
Okay. Good stuff. All right, Fred. Do you want to get, or I need to be able to say wrong?
Okay, well, so you'll have an opportunity to say wrong, because it was hard for me to pick between two, because there's two that I really resonate with. The first one was embrace tension and create contradictions.
Yep.
Okay. So I don't know if that one's right or wrong. The other one is
they're all right.
Do the counterintuitive thing.
Yes, those were both what I had for you.
You had two for me.
I did, because if you recall, the last time we recorded, when we were all supposed to go around and say one thing, you said you were going to break the rules and do two things.
You did that, Fred.
That is true.
Yes. So I did the intuitive thing and guessed that you would do two.
I'm seeing a precedent being set.
Yeah, tell me what stood out.
I actually feel like those two really, to me, resonate a lot with each other. I love the story in the do the counterintuitive thing chapter. I think it's actually I forget which of the chapters in the one about the Ray phone at Umpqua Bank.
Talk about that.
Sorry, it's in my chapter. It was definitely one of those two chapters. So you're going to have to find something else to talk about. But I love that, and what I immediately thought about is like, oh, I wonder how many banks went out and like put a phone in their branches. Like what makes it the counterintuitive thing is not the fact that it was a phone. It was that for an institution that was growing at that level, starting to see that scale, opening branches at an unprecedented rate, expanding that access to the leader of the bank was counterintuitive, right? Like that was a counterintuitive move, not the fact that you necessarily opened up that channel. And so I think what really kind of resonated with me in that chapter was the goal for an institution is not to go read case studies about what the bank down the street did, or what the bank in the region next door did, or what the bank on the other side of the country did, and then figure out how to do that, right? Is to figure out, like, what is that truth for you? Like, what is the thing that is going to resonate with your ideal customers, your ideal members, and is not what they're expecting, and then stand that up in a way that's really going to like surprise and delight the experience. And I think more often than not, I run into it, I'm sure you guys probably do as well. Institutions are like, well, just tell me what is working for XYZ Bank and we'll go do the same thing. And that ultimately is not going to pay off the dividends that if you really like think internally about what's really going to resonate with your ideal customers.
Well,
Right.
can-
And I had a tough love. Go ahead, Jack. Sorry.
I think Fred hit on something really important. If you look at the NFL, for example, everybody wants to be like the Kansas City Chiefs, but you can't because there's only one Patrick Mahomes. The reason that the Umpqua story is so powerful is Ray Davis, because Ray got going with this bank when it was really little. It was a very boutique-oriented bank, but Ray had a vision, and it was that counterintuitive. I don't want to be like a bank, and that's the counterintuitive thing that Fred talked about.
Right. No, and I'm gonna add two things to the mix. I love the Ray phone story, but doing the counterintuitive thing is not just a one-off event. It gets into your culture and it becomes part of doing business. A great example of that is quite a few years after the Ray phone, Rilla Delorier joined Umpqua Bank as their chief digital officer. And one of the things that she did was to create a fintech within the bank. This was before it was a thing. And it was a chat agent where you could pick your own, chat agent. So it's already pretty cool, right? I could kind of scroll through, pick someone like me. But then the even more counterintuitive thing, which is very Ray phone-esque, is that it wasn't just for high net worth individuals or, for commercial banking. It was for anyone with any balance and any product mix at any time. And so it continues, right? These are not one-off things. These become part of the fabric of your brand, and what it stands for and how you bring it out into the world. So I love that it continues. And, there's certainly some even more recent examples from Umpqua and from other banks that doing the counterintuitive thing, once you get over that first fear of it, it just kind of continues to go. So I think it's a very, very cool thing.
Didn't they refer to that as my BFF?
They did actually. Fun story.
Right.
Yeah, fun story. It was my BFF, and then it was renamed Pivotus. And then the fintech that I was working for at the time we were a fintech. We bought a fintech from a bank, which was kind of a strange setup at that time. Amazing. And so it was, it was just one of those things. It's just a very different way of thinking.
My BFF is a way better name than Pivotus.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't comment on that for a lot of reasons. But it was
I will hold that as a personal opinion.
There you go.
Yes. The opinions expressed on this show are not. Yeah. But all good. So no, I appreciate that on the counterintuitive thing. And then you said the second principle that stood out.
The second principle that stood out was to embrace attention and create contradictions. Mm-hmm. And again, like I think the two of them really kind of play well with each other. Like in a lot of ways, I think like in doing the counterintuitive things, frequently you create that tension. And I think like embracing the tension that comes up, embracing that contradiction, and really kind of stepping into it is what's powerful about it. Like I think a lot of people want to, step away from something that's tension and that creates tension into something that feels easier. But I think like in that tension, whether it's, creating the tension internally to get people to come up with more creative ideas, or to create that tension with your customers to get them to really kind of respond to and tell you what they're really after. Like, I think there's a lot of power in that. I had a question back for you, which was really like, and I think it could be a question for all of us, but for you to start with, like, how do you help banks lean into both of those? Because I think that in a lot of ways, those are also the two most counterintuitive things for banks out of your 5 principles.
That's a great question. When I work with banks on this, the way I talk about it is tension. It's raw materials, right? When you're building or rebuilding a brand, the first thing you want to do, which is part of cue the remix, is look around at what are the raw materials that you have. And for better or worse, in financial services, we are always going to have tension, and we're always going to have contradiction, sometimes for good reason, sometimes by design, sometimes for not so great reasons. But at the end of the day, we can hem and haw about it, or we can use it as raw materials. It's a raw material just like everything else, just like the history of the bank, just like your vision, mission, values, just like your colors. It's all raw materials for building or rebuilding this thing. So you want to throw it in there, right? Because, I mean, not to sound like too woo woo about it, but I mean, it's an energy force, right? So, let's use it, let's harness it, right? If we have a lot of tension between, I don't know, internally in a branch, or tension because of M&A, let's use that, right? I mean, that could actually be a brilliant campaign. And I'll tell you an example. Justin Dunn, who is one of the best marketers in our space, who's at WSFS or WizFizz, has used the tension of M&A and the contradiction between modern brand and great national bank of yesteryear. And he's used it in playful ways to drive home the point, like, yeah, I know that they're old, but it's really going to help us out externally and internally. So if you haven't kind of studied or watched his work, or follow that bank, especially their billboard game, do, because it's funny. And it's just basically calling out what we know, which is this sucks when you do M&A. It sucks from a brand standpoint for sure, but we're going to make the best of it. And so he leans in and uses it as a raw material. So I think that's the way I kind of approach it, is I just try to diffuse it, right? This is just a thing, just like everything else, that we're just going to throw in and mess with and see what happens. So, all right, now for the real test. Dun, dun, dun. What did Eric Cook pick? I had you in cue the remix.
Wrong.
Oh, dang it. Okay. I was thinking like AI.
Like Fred, and yeah, I can see that. The thing that jumped out at me, though, I mean, there's probably multiples. And you and I have had a lot of conversations. We've had the pleasure of actually, and I'll loosely say co-present, because I basically was there as comedic fodder just to make you look even better than what you already are for an event we did together in Wisconsin. Yes. But that was absolutely one of the high points. That was so much fun. But I kind of gave Fred some crap already about the Ray phone, but it falls underneath the tension and contradiction. It wasn't a phone, but it was Charlie Cook, my father, a 33-year banking veteran who had his office intentionally right off the lobby. And if anybody wanted to see Charlie Cook, they could walk right past the receptionist. There was no gate. There was no locked door. If he had a customer with him, he would shut the door out of respect to privacy. Other than that, my dad's door was always open. And he got a lot of crap from his banker buddies because they all had second floor offices. You had to get in an elevator with a code. You had to, do you have an appointment? And people would walk in, farmers with literally crap on their shoes would walk right in and go right past whoever was sitting at the reception new accounts desk and peek their head in and go, "Hey, Charlie, you got a minute?"
Yeah.
And
that's amazing.
that was not what you would expect from a bank, and not what you would expect. And as somebody, you grow up in a household with a mom and a dad, and your dad goes away to work, and you think he goes to work at a bank. You don't really appreciate what he does until you're there for 13 years working side by side and seeing what that does. And said to myself, if I ever got to this point and I got to be in his office I'm even getting a little emotional talking about this, but I got to sit at his desk for a few years before I decided I wanted to go play on the internet for a living and do something else. But I maintained that the door was always open. People could always come in, and even as a regional president, you always could pop in. And I heard the same, "Hey, Eric, you got a hot minute? Hey, Eric, I got a question for you." And that is not what you expected. We eventually were acquired. We got merged. And the bank that acquired us, the CEO, sat at the very end of a very long hallway behind two locked doors. And I could tell that things had changed. This was not the Ray phone era, the Charlie Cook era any longer. And to me, that's what really resonated. So I know I poked a little fun at you, Fred, about taking the Ray phone, but it was a different perspective of that. And we weren't on a serious growth trajectory, and we didn't have the elements that Umpqua had in the book, but it was cool to be around after a few years and realize, you mean everybody doesn't do what my dad does? And
Right.
How proud that made me of the way that he ran that bank. And that was pretty cool. So yeah.
No,
That is cool.
it is. I think it's amazing. And we've been talking about things in a previous era with doing the counterintuitive thing. I'm going to bring it to now because Jill Castilla
Totally.
with Citizens Bank of Edmond puts her cell phone out there all
Absolutely.
the time. When you walk into their one branch, and it's a beautiful branch in Edmond, Oklahoma, exactly what you said. I'm trying to think when I went to visit her last, if there's even a door or if it's just a opening. But when you walk in, immediately to the left, it's all glass. I'm sure there's a door. There has to be a door. But anyway, it's all glass, and she's just sitting there. Like the Jill Castilla, just sitting there, and anyone comes in, she's like waving, they're popping their heads in. Hey, Chaco. They're doing all their things. And so that's a modern way of taking the counterintuitive thing. And I think the challenge is it shouldn't be counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Banking is a noble profession. That's something that Rilla says all the time, and I truly believe it. That's why I try to be on the periphery of it as much as I can. At the end of the day, the things that we're listing shouldn't be counterintuitive when we're having this conversation again. They should be part of how we do business. And if they can't be right now, those are the things, the fences that we need to be taking down and not worrying about some of these other small fences that don't matter. So I think that's kind of a challenge for the folks that are going to listen, and a challenge for the four of us. Should not be counterintuitive to do those types of things.
Absolutely. Well, here's the thing, though, right? Like, it's the objective was the same theoretically across those three, right? It was to help to remove friction between bank leadership and the customers, right?
Right.
And each of the three, Ray and Charlie Cook and Jill, all do it in their own unique way that works for them and works for their customers and their institution, right? That to me is part of the power of it. Is we all want to try, or we all should hopefully as bankers want to try to remove friction from the process whenever we can, but we don't all have to do it the same way, right? We all need to find out what's the right way that resonates for me, that resonates for my brand, that's going to scale effectively with the type of business that we're looking to build. And there's 100 different ways to do it. There's probably, hopefully, 10,000 different ways to do it, because there's 10,000 institutions in the U.S. But the purpose is to do it, and to do it in a way that is true to who your brand is.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I love that because in my conversations with bank CEOs and CMOs, they'll bring up examples from the book, like, well, we could never do what Umpqua does, or we could never do what whatever. Okay.
Right.
What
Perfect.
can, right, great.
You shouldn't. You're not
but what,
Umpqua.
yeah, you should, right? But what can
Yeah.
you do? And it kind of goes back to one of the things you were talking about earlier, Fred, with competition, right? And so the intuitive thing is, what is the bank down the street doing? What is, this bank doing? And we'll just repeat that. And I had a tough love moment with this CEO last week where I said, it's somewhat career limiting, but I said, the competition is you. You're the competition. He's like, well, what do you mean by that? I said, the status quo that you have created and upheld here, the doing nothing, that's your competition. That's what's preventing you from growing. It is not the degree to which you can mimic the person down the street or have an app as good as Chase or whatever it is. I'm like, you're actually the competition. Until you've addressed that competitive threat, it doesn't matter what the other banks are doing, right? And so a lot of what we talk about in the book is how do you take that, whatever that first step is, for the love of God, take it, right? Just, start that momentum, start that forward progress. And it'll take you so much further than you realize and that you think. So I know we're almost at time, so I'm curious, because I'm a summarizer. What's the one thing that a listener to this podcast, maybe they fast forwarded through all of this, what's the one thing that they should take away from the book? We'll start.
Be yourself. Everyone else is taken.
Ooh,
Well said. Ooh, with
that'd
the
make
quote.
a good tattoo.
All right. Top that,
I was going to
Eric
say
Cook.
that'd make a really good tattoo.
Yeah,
On you,
would.
yeah.
That would. Yeah.
It would be my first one. A lot of it resonates back to the Simon Sinek starts with why. And I talk about this a lot. I did this just last week, is nobody cares about what you do. Nobody really cares about how you do it, but you need to be able to elicit and share why you do what you do, what gets you out of bed, what gets you excited to unlock your doors in the morning and welcome your customers. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, this book is an easy book to read, but answering the questions that it presents is tough, especially if you are one of those self-competitive, we've built this as an institution that's lived on these same principles forever and ever and ever. That is not an easy thing to do, but it's important. And it's a journey that if you want to survive and to be relevant and have people know you and like you, or maybe love you and trust you, it's a necessary process you need to go through. And this is a blueprint, if you're willing to put in the work, that will help you get there. And I thank you and Liz for writing it, because it's sparked a lot of conversations that I've been able to have with banks and giving them a reason to think a little differently in a lot of different ways.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Fred?
I will say, love the tension, live in the tension, embrace the tension. It is the crucible for which you can really find meaningful change in your organization, whether it's between the friction and removing friction between your customer engagement points and doing that in a riskful and a compliant way, whether it's, your M&A examples, whether it's, examples of making sure that you're looking at the incentives between your traditional bankers and your wealth managers and other people in the same institution. Find those tension points and lean in, because those are some quick areas to find places to make a difference.
Amazing. Wow, I should have interviewed you guys for the book. It would have been much more eloquent.
You
The next edition, the
next
refresh
edition.
edition.
actually let me
No.
ask the question a little differently. So we've all given you what our takeaways are. The question that I would love for you to answer is, and there probably are things we've already talked about, but what would
Okay.
be the one thing that got left out of the book that you wish you would have included? And maybe that'll be insight into the second edition.
Every time I talk to you, you're talking about the second edition. It is not going to
We got to sell
happen.
more mugs.
You know how many gray hairs this book has
Oh.
given me?
But I'm curious, what,
Liz
because
has
you've had so
none.
many conversations with folks like us and others, what stands out? Is there
think it's-
something that jumps out at you?
I think it's exactly what you just said. It's the conversations that I've had that are maybe not the best in class, way up here, John Janklis, Partners Federal Credit, like the big names, the everyday stories, which is frankly what has been the most gratifying. The smaller things that people have done to think more like a brand than a bank. I would definitely put that in there. And then I think the other piece is so much data went into the points of view in the book. And we talked about some, like with Kantar, and there was some pretty good stuff in there. But I think we could have done more. I think we could have done more. And one of the things Liz and I have talked about is actually updating the data sets and publishing them out to folks so that they can continue to make a business case for brand, because that's where it starts. All the things we've talked about are great, but unless you've made a business case for brand at your company, at your institution, it's going to be really hard to do these things. So I think a bit more data probably throughout I would have done. And I love the idea of the Starbucks story being in reverse. Like if there is a 2.0, that will be in there. I
You
promise.
heard it here first, everybody.
You heard it here first exclusively on this podcast. But speaking of, that's a wrap for this episode. But I know Jack has something planned for next episode that maybe he could close us out with.
Ever since I started my company back in 2000, I wanted bankers to kind of think differently and think like a resource manager. And a resource manager is somebody who thinks very differently in terms of adding value and being a go-to banker, a lot like what you wrote in your book. And I have this bad habit of reading a sales book almost every week, and then I call the authors. Like, what a dumbass thing to do. Who's going to talk to you? Well, the fact is, everybody talks to you. And so I found this this post on LinkedIn from these two guys, Colin Coggins and Garrett Brown. And they wrote this book. They teach entrepreneurialism at Southern Cal, and the class is always sold out. And this book is as close to being a resource manager as I've ever seen. It's a book that I recommend every banker read, and we're going to talk about it the next time. It's called The Unsold Mindset, and it's exciting. It's a good book.
It's exciting. And Jack, do you know it just connected with me, even though you said Colin Coggins at the beginning before we were recording? I worked with Colin. I'm not kidding. Like, I have worked with Colin Coggins when he was just a little pup. He's still a pup, but I worked with him, and that is amazing. So of course I will tune in, but I am also going to reach out to him now because I did not realize that he had written
It's amazing.
a book.
Good.
So that's
Well,
awesome.
and I know why they took your call, because you're Jack frickin' Hubbard. So
Truth.
let's just make sure that's part of the public record here as well. So, yeah,
Because I'm
I
Jack
I'm
appreciate
freaking
Jack
Hubbard.
frickin' Hubbard.
I appreciate that.
Well, Fred, do you want to bring some professionalism here and in the episode
you
in
ask
the,
me? I don't
the professional
understand.
way?
I think you're gonna get bad results either way. I don't know how much professional I'm gonna add, but no, this was phenomenal discussion. Thank you so much for leading our first official discussion episode of the Bankers Book Club. And tune in next month for our next episode. Thank you again, everybody.
See everybody. Thanks.
Where ledgers meet literature.
Bankers Book Club, making bankers better. Bankers Book Club.
Where ledgers meet literature.